first walked in and saw Greg walking up singing, I thought I made a big mistake. I thought I'd walked into Cascade Colt Church. But we're okay. Here we are. Also, I started coming here because of the sound biblical teaching and the unapologetic stance on the Bible. And now I'm preaching. Now I'm also questioning that as well. This is unbelievable. But I'm really excited to be here because I love public speaking. I love teaching. But most importantly, I love being able to share what has positively impacted me. And I had a really rough start on my week. Everywhere I turned, I had somebody needing something from me. I had someone expecting something from me. I had people beating me down, not encouraging me. And all of a sudden I was like, you know what? I need Wednesday night Bible study. So I showed up to Wednesday night Bible study. I said, I need refreshed. And then I broke my phone. Just shattered it. Destroyed it. And then I went 4 days without my phone. And all of a sudden I realized, holy cow, those people that were beating me down and sucking my energy, they can't reach me. I'm on my own. And now the rest of my week has been amazing. And now here we are, Sunday morning, ready to start a fresh week. I have a little story to share to start off my sermon here. There's stupid. There's extremely stupid. And then there's, quote, cementing your head inside a microwave, end quote, stupid. Firefighters in Wolverhampton, England say they were seriously unimpressed after 5 of them had to spend over an hour dealing with a case of the ladder. Thursday, the BBC reports the West Midlands Fire Service says that a 22-year-old man, it describes a YouTube prankster, and his friends poured several bags of fast-hardening product into an unplugged microwave oven that they were using as a mold for his head. Firefighters say that by the time they were called, the man's friends had been trying to get him out for 90 minutes. But don't worry, they were intellectuals. They gave him a breathing tube, so he was okay. The watch commander said, as funny as this sounds, it sounds pretty funny, this young man could have easily been injured, even suffocated. Oh boy. Well, I typed in to the internet, people doing stupid things. I was thoroughly entertained. It was great. But when I read this story, a couple things come to mind, and they actually align with my key points in today's sermon. First off, acting on your own understanding may get you in trouble, especially if you're stupid. Also, you can't expect perfect results from imperfect people. I can't look at this story and be surprised. We're human. We make mistakes, even if we wind up cementing our head in a microwave. And unrelated to this story specifically, but relating to our lives, we're not left to try and rely on our own understanding. We have God's calling, and ultimately, His calling is worth walking. So, let's go into the Bible and look at another example of someone doing something pretty stupid. If you can turn to 1 Samuel chapter 15, I'll catch up with you in a bit there. I'm going to stop in 1 Samuel 9. We're going to look at the life of Saul real shortly. Now, here's a little forewarning. Okay, Saul did not walk God's calling. So this is an example of something not to do. Well, let's look at what Saul was like before his great demise. In 1 Samuel 9, we read here in verse 2, he has a son whose name was Saul. This is speaking of Aphiah, the father of Saul. He has a son whose name was Saul, a choice and handsome man. And there was not a more handsome person than he among the sons of Israel. From his shoulders and up, he was taller than all of the people. So initially, we read that Saul was quite a specimen. He was pretty much everything Israel was looking for in a king. At this point in time, Israel was looking at the other nations around them, and they're like, well, these people have kings. We want a king. And God was like, you don't need a king, you have me. But is the people of Israel put their foot in the sand and said, no, give us a king. And this is who they got. A tall, ruggedly handsome man who came from a warrior family who wasn't afraid to pick up a sword and get his hands dirty. Well, lucky for him, God had a specific calling on his life. We read about it here in 1 Samuel 15, verse 3. Now go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has. At this point, Saul, the guy he is, from the tradition that he has, is like, shit, I'm going to fight somebody. This is going to be great. But God continues. He says, do not spare them, but put to death both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Now, the first time I read that, I was like, oh, that's a little extreme. Like, child and infant, ox and donkey, like, that's a completely obliterating a society. But if you know the context of why God is commanding this, the people of Amalek were the people that were following the Hebrew people as they were escaping Exodus and wandering through the desert for 40 years. And they would come in and attack, brutalize, rob, kill, and even worse, God's people. They did it for 40 years. They ignored all warning to stop. And finally, God had decided that it was enough. This is a Sodom and Gomorrah type situation. There is no good found there, and something needs to be done. And Saul was the man to take care of it. So God places this calling on Saul's life. Go get it done. Take these people out. They're evil, and they need to be stopped. And here's what happens. 1 Samuel 15, verses 17 through 23. Samuel said, is it not true, though you were little in your own eyes, you were made the head of the tribes of Israel? And the Lord appointed you king over Israel? And the Lord sent you on a mission and said, go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they are exterminated. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord, but rush upon the spoil, and did what was evil in the sight of the Lord? Granted, God was calling this death upon the Amalekites for evil done against the Lord. Saul is hopping right in their camp. Then Saul said to Samuel, this is good. Hold on, I did obey the voice of the Lord and went on a mission on which the Lord sent me. I have brought back Agag, the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But it was the people who took some of the spoil, the sheep and the oxen, the choicest of the things devoted to destruction, to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. Then Samuel brings down the hammer. He says, has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than to sacrifice, and to heed or listen is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and insubordination is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. A couple things here. Okay. First of all, Saul partially obeyed God. He went out and he cleaned up shop. The only person left was the king, and I don't think he ended up too well either. He was stuck in Israel the rest of his life, and I'm pretty sure it wasn't a very long one. So he partially obeyed, but didn't completely obey. And Samuel was not impressed. Samuel walked up to Saul and said, I thought you had a distinct calling and you were going to fulfill it. Why didn't you? In verses 17 through 19. But Saul does something very stupid. Okay? He tries to explain himself to both God and Samuel. He says, hold on. I did obey. That's a lie. You partially obeyed. You didn't completely obey. And then he says, later on in verse 21, hold on. It wasn't me. It was those people. Those people were the ones that messed up. Don't be mad at me. Pretty cowardly behavior from a king. And although that seemed pretty egregious and like, whoa, I would never do that, we do this all the time, right? Let me give you some extreme examples before I bring kind of close to home. Okay, guy, okay. I shouldn't have done those drugs. Shouldn't have done it. Bad idea. I regret it. But they were half off. Like, my dealer had a deal. Like, it's financially irresponsible of me to not buy the drugs, right? Like, I had to. You see where I'm at, right, God? Or, okay, God. I shouldn't have tricked that kid. But Costco had just buffed the floors, and he was running really fast, and when I tripped him, he just... Right? Those are some extreme examples, but more often than not, it sounds something like this. Okay, I shouldn't have lied. That was wrong. Blatant sin. But I did it for them. I was protecting them. They can't know the truth. Or maybe, okay. Cheating is wrong. I get it. Shouldn't do it. But everyone else is doing it. And they're the ones that convinced me to do it. Don't point the blame at me. It's their fault. This is exactly what Saul's doing here. Sadly, this can be fairly close to home at times. In my household growing up, I love my parents. Okay? In my household growing up, we had a thing called a direct disobedience. And if you were ever guilty of a DD, it was an immediate spanking. Swift. And if it wasn't immediate, that meant Dad was coming home, and it was going to be soon, but it was happening. There is no direct disobedience in the household of God that goes unpunished. We can read in verses 22 and 23 that God has something to say to Saul. Has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? In other words, it's better to obey with a frown. I don't want to do this, but I'm doing it. Than to disobey with a smile. I know what I'm supposed to do, but I'd rather do this. Obedience is more important than attitude. Ideally, once we're walking the calling, our attitude will follow, and we'll have a good attitude and good obedience. But ultimately, when pressed with an option, obedience comes before attitude. And in 23 it says, for rebellion is as the sin of divination, and insubordination is as iniquity and idolatry. Here we go. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. This is the passage that led to the demise of Saul. A couple chapters later, after losing his mind, being tormented, he ultimately loses his life. And he was stripped of his title of king because of his failure to be obedient to God's calling. Now that's unfortunate. However, like I said earlier, you can't expect perfection from imperfect people. That's like having a little kid come up to you and be like, hey, can I mow the lawn? But you know they're just going to take it right to the garden. Just meow. It's like, that's a bad idea. You can't expect like the cat sunbathing. Like this could go poorly. Expecting perfection from imperfect people is folly. So we can't be relying on our own understanding. And we can't be relying on our own initial idea of what's right or what's wrong. Let's look at a more, I don't want to say biblical, but uprighteous example. Peter. Peter was not perfect, but Peter was the rock on which Jesus built his church, unlike the cowardly King Saul. So if you go to Matthew, chapter 26, verses 69 through 75, we see one of Peter's less than perfect moments. Okay? This is a moment in which Peter relied on his own interpretation of the situation rather than acting under control of the Holy Spirit and following God's calling. We read here at verse 69. Now Peter was sitting outside the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him and said, hey, you too are with Jesus the Galilean. But he denied it before them all, saying, I do not know what you are talking about. When he had gone out of the gate, another servant girl saw him and said to those who were there, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it with an oath. He promised. He says, "I do not know that man." A little later, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Surely you too are one of them, for even the way you talk gives it away." Then he began to curse and swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately a rooster crowed, and Peter remembered the word which Jesus had said, "Before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. Here's Peter's understanding of the situation. They just took my teacher, and they took him captive. They're going to crucify him. I'm his follower, one of his closest. Surely, if they catch me, I'm going to have a very similar fate. There's no way they can find out who I am. So he chose to hide his true identity. While he acted out of sin, lying under oath, lying, bringing a curse on himself, even while he acted in sin, it was still heavenly ordained. Because the God that we serve already had known he's going to deny me 3 times, because he's going to be caught up in his own ways, in his own walk. So when Peter spoke out of his own understanding, just like we act out of our own understanding, God still has that plan for you. God still has that calling. Regardless of your perfection, we've already established you aren't perfect. Regardless of your perfection, that plan is still there. Giving up on God, saying, "Oh, I'm not good enough for God." Don't disrespect him like that. You don't have to be good enough for God. He's good enough for you. The selfless act of love that Jesus took on the cross for us, that's good enough for you. You don't got to be good enough right now. We work towards that. That's the goal. But ultimately, step by step, it starts by walking your calling. Sometimes we feel very strongly about our calling, what we think is right. We're like, "Oh, I'm supposed to do that. I'm supposed to be a baseball player." I feel very strongly about that. You can look at my actions. I wake up at very early hours to go work out and train to be a baseball player. I put crazy amounts of hours on the field to go be a baseball player. Right? Even on days off. They aren't off days. I'm still working towards being a baseball player. I feel very strongly about my calling currently being a baseball player. Peter also felt very strongly that he did not know Jesus. Our feelings can mislead us. Our feelings can lead us astray. We need to find out for ourselves who God says we are and what his plan is for us. The most simplest way I can explain it is this. When I'm calling the shots, that means God isn't. When God's calling the shots, that means I'm not. And why would I settle for humanity when I can rely on divinity? We have unbridled access to the throne room of God at any moment in time. God and us are in fellowship. When you're saved and you have Christ, that's a right. You deserve that right to have that fellowship with God, not because of your actions, but because of Christ's actions. Why rely on your own understanding when you have unbridled access to God's understanding? Lastly, I've got 8 minutes, oh boy. Lastly, let's turn to Psalms 33 to ultimately look at God's plan. Because I could speak in the absolutes. Be like, "Oh, God wants you to not sin." Thanks, Brody. Didn't know that. Cool. Right? Or I could speak super vague, in the abstract. Right? I could be like, "Oh, you should just follow what God wants you to do. Again, thank you, Brody. Didn't know that. That doesn't necessarily help you practically. Ultimately, what it requires, what it takes to find your calling and to find where you need to go is to find God. Start there. That's something I can't do from behind the pulpit, but that is something that you can get help with from your brothers and sisters. This is a congregation full of people that are willing to listen and help and share to help you find that calling. My brother asked me, he's like, this was years ago, he goes, how do you find out what your gifts are, your spiritual gifts? And I had a mentor tell me, and when I asked the same question, I said, you just start serving. And eventually, God starts narrowing down what you're good at and what you're not good at. I like teaching. I like talking, shocker. I don't like the hospitality side of things. If you're like, hey Brody, go do this, go speak to these kids. You don't have any time to prepare, but do something cool. I'd be like, sweet, let's do it. But if you're like, I want you to arrange these beautiful bouquets that we have here this morning, I'd be like, oh no. This is not going to end well. All right? Happy I'll probably leave. Be like, oh, gross. Out of here. Different people have different responsibilities and different callings. The best way to find out your specific calling is to start walking. That's my best practical advice. If you want to get into the specifics, that's why we've got Greg. Enjoy the responsibilities. I'm stepping away.
Thanks, bro.
Yeah. All right. So let's look at God just a little bit in respects to his plans. Psalms 33, verses 8 through 12. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spoke, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. The Lord nullifies the counsel of the nations, and he frustrates the plans of the people. The counsel of the Lord stands forever, the plans of his heart from generation to generation. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people whom he has chosen for his own inheritance. Verse 8 mentions a fear of the Lord. Okay? There's a couple different translations of fear of the Lord in the Bible. Some of them, like we see in the Damascus experience from Saul to Paul, different Saul, not the old King Saul, the Apostle Paul. When he hit the ground, when Jesus appeared to him, that was a knees-shaking fear of the Lord. I'm about to get struck down. Then there's a fear of the Lord that's more of a respect. Probably one of the most common ones. Fear of the Lord. God, I understand you're the ultimate authority. I'm going to respect you and do as you say. That's also fear of the Lord. This fear of the Lord is an awestruck wonder. Okay? So there's a fear with a quaking of the knees. Oh my goodness, God's going to kill me. There's a fear with a quaking of the mind. God's so good. He's so great. God's so wonderful and powerful, and the respect. Then there's a quaking of the heart. And that's the awestruck. The God I serve is pretty cool. All right? That's the fear of the Lord that we're called to have here. Stand in awe of him, verse 8 says. There's my name. Turn that off. For he spoke, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. I like verse 11. It says, the counsel of the Lord stands forever. That means it's not going to change. And I'm pretty sure I had mentioned this once before, maybe during a communion meditation. But here's why it can't change, okay? I have in between my hands nothing, right? There are atoms bouncing around, floating. But even within those atoms, there's lots of empty space, right? There is nothing. Think of that space in between the atoms where there truly is no matter, okay? There is something there. There's potential. Things can occupy that space. Before God created the world, and before God spoke it into existence, there wasn't nothing. There was nothing to put nothing. That space, that empty void, didn't even exist. There wasn't even a potential for something to exist. Not even time, not even space. So God exists completely outside of the world we understand, restricted by space and time. So while we experience time, God observes time. He is not impacted on time passing. He sees it all in one moment. And the most important element of change is time. Time must take place for change to follow. But God is not restricted to the confines of space and time. Therefore, God is literally incapable of changing. So when the passage says, the counsel of the Lord stands forever, you can take that to the bank. That ain't going to change. God has held your life in His hands since before the beginning of time. And here you are, in this moment, getting to live out His wondrous creation. Because of that awestruck wonder of the God we serve, why not walk in that calling on your life? Why not follow what God has for you? You can call the shots. You have responsive will. But as we read about with Saul, and as we read about even with Peter, relying on your own understanding, that's a fool's game. Especially when you have the opportunity to easily surrender to God and let Him call the shots. You have a choice, and with that choice, there is responsibility. You could try and do it on your own. I did, and I had a crappy beginning of my week. Or you can step aside and surrender your life knowing that God truly has what's best for you in mind. And He has a plan. And He has a calling worth walking. Let's pray. Yeah, we'll pray for those sirens. Lord, as we wrap up here, I pray for those sirens. Although we don't know the context of the situation, Father, I pray that You will be with everyone involved. I pray that You will provide the first responders with the knowledge and understanding of the situation to properly handle everything. And I pray for those that are involved, whether victims or bystanders, that You will be able to comfort them and give them peace. As for us this morning, thank You for the opportunity to gather and get into Your Word. Pray that as we leave today, that we will put our heads on our pillows with a greater understanding of You and what You have for us in our lives with our calling than we did this morning. Thank You for Your faithfulness to us and Your selfless act of love on the cross. In Jesus' name, amen.